Hey, this is Erin Wiley Sands, political blogger and creator of the AmERINcan. Okay, 2020 has been an absolute crazy year. And in the face of the gruesome and senseless murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and the reopened case of Elijah McClain, there has been a mandate regarding police. We are re-examining everything. There's a reckoning going on right now. A lot of people are saying reform. Some people are saying defund. And FYI, defund is not as scary a word as people, try to make it. It is actually a reallocation of funds based on the needs of that particular community. But still, people are calling for both. And so I wanted to go to the source. I wanted to go to the source and talk to police officers. And I wanted to do that with a good friend and a brilliant political mind who is going to guest host with me today, Sterling Macer Jr. And I'm also grateful to have KEVIN Dunighan. He's been a police officer for 32 years with the LAPD. He's retired and he's come forward to sit in the hot seat. He's going to let us ask him some questions and, give us a point of view from the other side. So I hope you guys enjoyed this discussion and welcome to the other side. So first I want to introduce my guest co-host, Sterling Macer Jr. Hey, Sterling.
Hey, Erin.
Sterling is an actor, writer, producer, and like I said, a brilliant political mind. People always, kind of give me kudos on my savvy. But when I want to have an astute political conversation, he's the guy I go to. So he's the guy I look up to. He's, the king. So I also want to bring on KEVIN Dunighan. KEVIN, thank you.
Hey, thank you for having me. As you can see, I put my glasses on because I wanted to try to look as smart as Sterling, but it's not
great.
I hope you have better luck with the glasses than I do.
I'm going to be putting mine on later because I've gotten to that age where I can't really read without them. So, 32, you've been with the LAPD 32 years, right?
Yes, 32 and a half. I know I sound like a teenager saying that, but I put in the work, so I added on there. And I recently
You're now owner and operator of the Debonair Cigar Lounge, right, in Los Angeles.
Right, I'm one of the 4 owners of the Debonair Cigar Lounge. It's 1111 South La Brea.
Okay.
And, it's a Black-owned business, and it's we're trying to prosper in these strange times.
Yes, and so before we go into our interview, because we're going to hit the ground running, but I want to ask you, in terms of your business, is it open right now due to COVID? Can people come by and visit your place of business?
Yes. We went through the realignment or rearranging of our interior as far as making sure that we respected and adhered to the state's social distancing. We also, our employees wear masks, and we mandate that if you're going to be here, before you start smoking, if you're not smoking, to wear a mask.
Okay.
So we're open.
Okay. All right. Wonderful. Okay. So let's get to it. So I did a little research, KEVIN, and what I found in terms of American statistics, that 85% of police officers are male, 15% are female, over 65% of police officers are white, with only 12.8% being African American. So it's clear that we need more representation in this industry. And it's also clear that not many people are drawn to, be a part of it or to join the force. Mm-hmm. So my question for you is, as an African-American male, why did you become a police officer?
I became a police officer because I wanted to help. I wanted to serve. I wanted to do something that I saw as a child was noble. My first inclination was to become a fireman. As a kid, going to school in elementary school, I would walk past a fire station. And then I got into junior college, and one of my first classes was fire science. And not trying to be humorous, but in that first 2-hour lecture, the professor was talking about the various personalities of fire. And it's like, I had a fiance at the time, and I didn't want to deal with any other personalities. And I had a good friend who had already started the process with LAPD, and was asking him about it. And we both had a heart to serve, and so he explained to me the process. I did research, and I joined LAPD, and I believe that was the better decision of the two.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you kind of brought up the heart to serve and culture, because I want to bring up two monikers that are sort of used in the way we think of policing. So I want to bring these up, and then I want to ask you a question. But first, I want to give you my point of view. So
Okay.
on the cars, usually on a police car, you see the words protect and serve, correct?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So when I think of the words protect and serve, inherently, I feel that there's a bit of altruism when it comes to that. I feel like there's a peerhood when it comes to that. I feel a sense of community, equity. And when I hear the word protect, I feel like people who are doing that are trying to protect the community and its inhabitants from harm. When I hear the word serve, I think that these people are dedicated to either flourish or make the community thrive. That's what I think when I hear protect and serve. When I hear law enforcement, there's really nothing altruistic about that, because in a sense, you're already talking about somebody who's enforcing something. So if you're enforcing something, you're an authority. So there's something very authoritarian about it, maybe even autocratic. If you're enforcing a rule or a law, then you're going to do so via the parameters of the society, the laws that we've given you, or as well as your own bias, which could be racial or tyrannical. And that could express itself through violence. So with those two sort of monikers or school of thought, what do you think in terms of the culture of policing? What do most officers think of themselves as? People there to protect and serve, or law enforcement?
Well, understand, I became a police officer in 1986. So I basically have gone through, I'd say maybe 3.5 generations or 3.5 decades, of law enforcement. So I've seen a lot of changes. But to directly respond to your question, you have to understand the Los Angeles Police Department is a law enforcement agency first and foremost. And we do that within the guidelines of protecting and serving. So the unfortunate reality is that enforcing the laws, whether it be a minor infraction or a heinous felony, is what the police departments do. Whether it's the initial contact or the investigation aspect of it, as far as handing it over to the DA. So in doing that, when you say that you don't see how the two of them coincide, you have to also look at the young woman that's been raped, and we're out trying to find her assailant. We're trying to serve her. The unfortunate reality that we weren't there to protect her at the time. But I think that she, in the manner in which we do our investigation, with the care and concern that we do an investigation like that, she sees the service. She sees how we protect her. We keep her name confidential. And
I'm not saying that there aren't police officers who are doing that, but still we're here, where we are with the social unrest and the mandates for reform and defund, because there have been many cases that police officers aren't doing that. So I went to the U.S. Department of Justice Bureaus of Justice Statistics, and they said, and you can let me know your experience, because I'm sure that there are certain outliers, that only 3% of a day in, I guess, the life of a police officer is spent where you're interacting with maybe violent criminals or people who need to be put under arrest. So that means 97% normally is you're not facing violent crime. You're not, trying to catch the rapist. So in the case of even Elijah McCain, the 23-year-old.
Can I address something regarding the Bureau of Justice Statistics?
Mm-hmm.
Regarding that 3%, they're talking about the actual interaction as far as maybe felonious encounters. Mm-hmm. But you have to also understand that if you look at the totality of law enforcement, say with LAPD, we have 10,000 officers, and there's personnel. I won't just say officers. We have personnel. So you may have, given the scenario that I gave, you may have only 2 officers that are dealing with the actual victim and carefully and lovingly and caringly walking her through the process of the investigation. But you also will have 2 detectives that are also on that case that's not included in that 3%. You may also have a special TAC team, or you may have a special problems unit that's out looking for the assailant. To understand the dynamic of statistics understand that that 3% just represents the 2 officers that are hands-on, without the support team, detectives, special, the unit, the specialized units that are out looking for the assailant.
So you're saying those statistics don't actually count those other officers as police efforts towards solving or interacting the particular violent crime? Is that?
Yes, yes, that's what I'm saying, because those are talking about violent encounters, as far as based off of what Erin was saying. Well, the violent encounter is okay if you go to a crime scene and someone has murdered someone. Well, those 2 officers are that's that violent encounter. That's that preliminary police report that is submitted. So, but it doesn't include, like I said, the detectives and the support numbers that are there.
Okay, so, and believe me, I do understand that obviously every police officer can't be, somebody who is misusing or abusing their power. But speaking of that, because as I said, this is where we are right now in our nation, I want to bring up Elijah McCain, the 23-year-old. Are you familiar with that case?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So he's the 23-year-old. Someone reported a suspicious person in a mask. He was walking home. Officers confronted him. He was not armed. He had not committed a crime. And they were also found on camera saying as much. So we heard on the cameras with their body cam, the visual was turned off, but the audio was turned on. An officer saying that he was not committing a crime. He had, and I forgot how to pronounce this again. It's a carotid hold?
Carotid artery.
A carotid hold, which involves an officer applying pressure to the side of his neck in order to cut off the blood flow to the brain. When first responders got there, they injected him with ketamine, and he had a heart attack.
The paramedics, not the officers, right?
Yes, but I'm not done.
Okay.
He was injected with ketamine. He was brain dead, covered in bruises for 3 days before his family decided, that they needed to take him off of life support. But before the first responders were called, he gasped that he could not breathe. He tells them his name. He says he has an ID but no gun. He pleads that his house is right there. He sobs. He vomits. And then he apologizes for vomiting and says, I wasn't trying to do that. I just can't breathe correctly. Now, in the face of that, they still subdued him in a way that would not even seem as inhumane. And it's something that you would expect from an animal, not a human being. So please speak to that.
It's a tragedy. Bottom line, it's a tragedy. The best way I can respond is that, one, every department has their own different policy. Again, I don't know I'm not familiar with, I think it was Aurora, Colorado's police department. I'm not familiar with their use of force policy. I do, from the little bit of research that I did do, I believe that there was a 911 call saying that someone was acting suspicious, and this took place last month.
Let's stop there. So someone is acting suspicious. I'm a police officer. I come onto the scene. This young man is not armed. He has not committed a crime. Then why do I need 3 big burly men to sit on top of him and subdue him, especially when I told you what that man kept saying? I have an ID. I don't have a gun. I live right there.
Right.
That was an excessive use of force that led to basically his murder. He was murdered.
Yeah, in my opinion, yes, it was an excessive use of force. I don't know the size of these officers. In the research that I did, it didn't give a size or description of the 3 officers. But with that being said,
I'm just right.
You have to understand that there's a different mindset when it comes to law enforcement in this day and age. When I say a different mindset, I'm talking about what we first touched upon when we started, as far as a heart to serve. And so if you have most officers, because a lot of officers are retiring. I got on, like I said, in 86. I don't know too many officers that got on in the 80s that are still working, at least large, metropolis or big cities like LA.
Because I know you went through the Rodney King.
The point that I was getting at is that you have a generation of officers that are on the job now because during the early 2000s, with the recession and with the way things were going as far as, kids graduating from college and not being able to get the job that they expected. So it's like, okay, a public service job, whether it's fire department, whether it's police department, whether it's probation department. If you get into the law enforcement, you can't just look at it as this is a job I'm going to do and leave it as such. You have to basically put your heart and soul into it, and you have to make a sacrifice. And you have to learn to, in your training, and I'm not familiar with the Aurora PD's training, but I can only speak of LAPD's training, that we have, implicit bias training that basically makes you put a mirror in front of your face and say, hey, this is you. This is how you see people. This is your bias. And again, bias and prejudice and racist are two different things. I know in social media, people tend to use them, synonymously, but there are three different things. So, when you're forced to confront your bias, you're forced to be able to say, okay, I have to, regardless of how I was raised, I have to look at this person as I would look at myself. But the unfortunate reality is that there may be some other agencies that are out there that don't have implied bias training. There may be other police officers or other agents, or I won't say agents, with other police officers that refuse to operate in that context. As far as Elijah McClain, that was a tragedy.
I want to get into training, but I know Sterling has some questions, so I'm going to let him go before I just monopolize everything.
No, that's fine. Well, just to kind of follow up on that, I think I find it really interesting, and Kevin, it's really nice to hear from you and hear, from a Black officer, and get your perspective, especially in light of the times that we live in now, and what the situation that we see playing out, on an all too often is. So, my follow-up really has to do with what you were talking about as far as the new training. You came up starting in the 80s. I think you said 80, is that right?
86.
86. And so you were there like in the Dirty Daryl days, right? In the Daryl Gate days, where we got where it is hard for me to imagine, and I just want to make sure, and I want to make sure everybody out there knows, it's hard for me to imagine that Daryl Gates was implementing implicit bias training. You're talking about something far more recent, correct?
Right. Yes.
Okay. So when did that implicit bias training start? Versus like you start in 86, we go through all that Daryl Gate ugliness, and then we get that 2000 sort of change with the recession, as you articulated. I'm curious when that started.
Well, as far as the implicit bias or implied bias training, I believe that was probably, and I've been gone for a year, so I'd probably say 8 to 10 years ago. But that's because I'm old and don't know the exact date. But,
no.
But I will. But let me interject this. From day one in the academy, we had training called cultural diversity, and so in which we basically, at least in the academy, basically, the instructor says, okay, everything that's discussed within these four walls will not be discussed at all outside to your class leader or your DI. And, we had a lot of, and they had different speakers come in as far as from the Aryan Nation, from the gay community, from the Black community, different, from the Muslim community. And again, this is back in 86. And so we got to hear their side of the story and how they perceive law enforcement based off of some of the contacts and engagements that had happened in their community. And we were able to.
You said this was in 86 where you're getting this.
Yeah, he's saying this was in 86. So it wasn't implicit bias. So it wasn't implicit bias training, but you're saying that even in the Dirty Daryl Gates days, you had a kind of cultural, sort of multicultural, let's see what life and policing looks like from that particular culture's point of view training is what you had, correct?
Yes.
So that brings me to the area that I'm really want to drill down on, and by no means I want you to know this isn't about got you, and this isn't about you having to answer for every single cop that's out there. But I think it's a real opportunity to try and understand just exactly where the breakdown is, because clearly there's a breakdown. You are saying that even in 86, when, and when the policing, certainly in LA and throughout the early 90s and mid 90s, was at its most volatile state, almost combative, where literally it was a siege mentality that the LAPD.
I didn't see it as such, but if that's how you perceive it, okay.
Well, no. What I would go back to is for example, not Public Enemy, but NWA, and just the anthem that they were making big noises about. The police were making big noises about, F the police, and how that was being played, and how cops were feeling like, it was creating an environment where their lives were in danger, blah, blah, blah. I was here in LA at that time. So, I remember how that was being reported and how that was being articulated by law enforcement. So it sounds like didn't have that perception, but there's certainly that perception was out there.
Okay, let me say this. In, I believe it was 87, I walked a foot beat in Jordan Downs. Mm-hmm. And they were playing F the Police. Mm-hmm. What wasn't nothing new. Didn't cause me to change my perception. Didn't cause me to change it didn't raise the hair on the back of my head, because I knew who the bad guys were. The bad guys knew who I was, but I also knew who the good people that lived in that neighborhood were, and they knew who I was. Gotcha. No, so I understand. We're talking about you, and this is why I'm not looking at you to kind of personalize this and answer for your own behavior. Because clearly you're the exception. You're here. You're talking with us. You're trying to help understanding. But would you agree that there was a broad perception that was conveyed by law enforcement during late 80s, early 90s, that the police were somewhat under attack and that the people they were trying to police were hostile towards them? That's not your perception? Like, again, I can speak for myself, but let me say this, having worked around other officers of different ethnicities.
That's what I want to hear is officers writ large.
Okay, so for me and the partners that I work with, there were some officers in the late 80s, early 90s, prior to the riots, that had a quote unquote bias. Okay.
Right.
Could I say that they were racist? No, because I'm not with them 24. I'm not with them off hours. And the
I got you.
The veil that was there was department policy. So you had to treat, you had to operate within department policy. But there were calls that I rolled up on to where the witnesses or the victims were like, "Man, I'm glad you're here because I'm tired of this, Hispanic officer, this white officer calling me, the N-word."
No, gotcha. And again, I understand your personal experience and somewhat of the exception. Now, I want to kind of
let me hear behind this real quick because I know you have to go. But most of the encounters with officers of other ethnicities was based in ignorance, not prejudice or racist.
I got it. Oh, okay. Now let's look at this. This is what, as a thought exercise, and for you and for everybody that's going to see this, everybody that's out there now. Go back to those Rodney King beatings. Then I'm going to move on to something more immediate today. Go back to those Rodney King beatings and the cops that surrounded them. This is, LAPD, cops that surrounding, beating Rodney King. He's on his back. He's rolling around, but he's on his back. And these guys are taking they're taking full on Major League Baseball cuts with their batons at him.
As you're trained to do.
Four of them. Now imagine if you put a white hood and robe on top of those very same guys and you see that taking place. Mm-hmm. Can you sit here and say, anybody or even those of you out there, that then doesn't, we have a completely different understanding of what was taking place? Because my argument is that behavior in almost any other context, and certainly one more demonstrative like the KKK, that behavior is clear as to what it is. But simply because there's a uniform on and there's a badge worn, we're asked to see it in a different context.
Well, yeah, and your question is...
And so my question is, how is that behavior, man on his back, prone? Now you say you're trained to do that. My question is about the training, which I'm going to get to right now. So on his back, prone, waving, his arms aren't up. He's not taking swings at any officers. He's not trying to scramble to get to any officers, and they are beating him. That's the training? That's the training.
Yes, that's the training in this context. And I understand exactly what I'm going to say, because I watched the same thing as an African-American male when I saw it the first time. So, and I didn't envision, white hoods and that whole 9 yards.
You don't have to. I'm saying as a thought exercise. Okay.
So with that being said, if you look at the video in its entirety, there was, before they even got to the batons, there was non-compliance by Rodney King as far as him getting out of the car. The other three occupants got out of the car and they were detained. There was non-compliance, and then when he did get out of the car, there was a serious size difference. So that's why there was 4 officers instead of 2.
I see.
And now, hold on a second. And so also he was displaying signs of being under the influence of something. We later discovered that he was under the influence of PCP. So when you saw them taking those baseball type swings, he wasn't feeling it. Did it cause damage? Yes, it did.
That was to beat the PCP out of him. I'm not sure what the PCP has to do with.
Well, when you're dealing with somebody that's under the influence, especially if it's PCP, then they become a lot stronger than you, and they don't feel pain. Case in point, years ago when I was a security guard working at a hospital, I got body slammed by a 90 pound.
I understand about the PCP.
Let me get to the department policy in case hold on just 1 second. So when there's non-compliance, if I give a person a direct order, and this is the use of force policy that was back in 1991 when that took place, if there's non-compliance, then you go to the next step after verbal commands. So that's basically going hands-on. And so if you go hands-on, if you have to use your baton because of the size factor, then you're going to use your baton. We're trained that if the blow doesn't work the first time, then you swing harder.
Kevin, I got you. I'm only rushing because I'm going to have to jump off here real quick.
Okay. If need be, I'll come back for part 2.
That would be great. But here's really what I wanted to ask. Not really ask. I hear what you're saying, and I remember all the arguments about non-compliance and what led up to it and everything else, and how that was construed to be within department policy and everything else. And I think there are many out there that are arguing the same thing about George Floyd and everything else, and that he wasn't.
Well, I'm not arguing about George.
But there are many, and that gets so in the true cases of non-compliance, when we see that being argued in cases of like the neo-lynching of George Floyd, then that dilutes the authenticity of that argument across the board of non-compliance. Now, real quick, I wanted to get your we're in the midst of a big reform right now. It's coming no matter what we do, right? No matter how you feel, whether from the left or from the right, reform is coming. Even the most conservatives trot, Tim Scott, the Republicans trot Tim Scott out there to give some sort of weak-teed notion of police reform, and they kind of hide behind. They even recognize that reform is coming. So it's just a matter of how. And I think another way to contextualize this is, I think people of good conscience, everybody out there, that, and maybe I'm being a little overly optimistic, but all people of good conscience do not think that the knee on the neck lynching of Black men or the summary executions of Black women in their own home, well, in effect, summary executions, and the shooting in the back of fleeing assailants that are not running with whatever. Most people don't want to see that take place, and they don't feel like it should take place, most. So that having said, are you familiar with the 8 Can't Wait campaign?
I vaguely.
Okay, so I want to run that down to you, because what I'm really interested in getting at is this notion of understanding how to extract the racism from the system, so it is not systemic racism, right? Because we know, like, let's take those cops in I believe it's Wilmington, North Carolina, and are you familiar with some of their comments just recently?
The African American police chief, they were, I guess, their audit review of the tapes, they discovered they were saying
okay, so for example, some of them are saying Civil War. They want to see Civil War. They were talking about a black police officer, and they were saying, well, one of them calls this black cop. They say, oh, he's a real piece of shit, and one of them says, oh, well, let's see how his boys.
For you.
He's talking about his fellow black cop. He's white. They're white. He's black. They say, well, let's see how his boys take care of him when the shit gets rough. See if they don't put a bullet in his head, unquote. Right. They go on to say a civil war is coming. They speak about a black magistrate as an effing Negro magistrate, and that she needed a bullet in her head right then.
Okay, I'm familiar with it.
Move on. Well, but it's important because maybe those out there that are watching this are not. So I'm running this down. So later on, it says that Piner, one of these cops, tells the other cop more later conversation that he feels a civil war is coming, that he's ready. He advises that he's going to go out and buy a new assault rifle in the next coming weeks. And a short time later, this other officer begins to discuss how society is being close to martial law, and he can't really wait until they're just going to go out and just start slaughtering those fucking N-words, right? And says, God, I can't wait. And it just goes on and on and on. And it says, look, that'll put them back another 4 or 5 generations. That's what's out there. And or at least most African Americans and most, I think, cops would admit that that mentality is not located to just Wilmington, North Carolina. And that finds its way into the system. So if that is there, now what do we do is the question. And so 8 Can't Wait gets floated. And it is the idea that there's 8 principles that need to be enacted in every department in order to address reform. Now, I want to hear if you think that these 8 things will move towards addressing the systemic racism within police departments. And I just want to run them down real quick. 1 is the banning of chokeholds. 2 is required de-escalation. 3, requiring warnings before shooting. Some of these seem like really common sense to me. I'm surprised that they are not required by every department. 4, required exhaust of all alternatives before shooting. 5, a duty to intervene, right? That is the duty if you see a cop using excessive force, a fellow cop using excessive force, you have a duty to intervene. 6, or is that 5 or 6? That is 6.
I don't know that he's going to remember all 8.
Yes. Well, I'm
not that old.
I just want to know what's going to jump out to him. 6, ban shooting at moving vehicles. Right. 7, require use of force continuum. In other words, the force for the most extreme situations that's only when the most extreme kinds of force should be used, and lower situations, lower amounts of force need to be used. Okay. The force continuum. And finally, require comprehensive reporting. That is, every time an officer had to use force, every time an officer had to draw his weapon, all of those incidents have to be reported. So,
can I respond to that real quick?
Yes, absolutely. And I do know this.
Leave it or not. Each and every one of those 8 that you mentioned, they've been implemented by LAPD for years.
Well, actually, just about. And I was going to say this. LAPD is not signed off on 3 of those 8. But
which one?
They haven't signed off on requires warning before shooting. They haven't signed off on requires exhaust all alternatives before shooting. They haven't signed off on requires comprehensive reporting.
Well, here's the kicker with that. As far as the warning before shooting, is that there are certain situations that this will not allow you to give a warning. I.e., if someone quickly pulls a gun from their waistband, and I take the time as I'm drawing and exhibiting my weapon to give a warning, then you're going to end up with a dead police officer, because you have to understand the physical dynamics and the nuances of once you go from fight to flight in the context with your body and how lag time is initiated. Once you see that person pulling a weapon, now you're processing in your mind as a police officer, okay, I have to look at idols, which is the immediate defense of life. Yes, I'm within that context. I have to look at my background. Are there any kids or civilians behind this guy in case I miss? So you're processing all that while everything's going on. So to be able to say, let my brain take a moment and say, stop. If you draw your weapon, if you continue to draw your weapon, I'm going to shoot you. That's not going to. But we always do give a warning if we are given the opportunity to display our weapon.
It's not required by the LAPD. Huh? It's not required. It's a warning. A warning before shooting
is not required.
Whether you give it or not, it's not required.
Given the opportunity, when given the chance, there's always a warning given. Sir, drop the gun. Sir, put your hands up. Sir, if you don't comply.
I understand, but right now I'm just going by these principles. Right now, it's not required. Let me ask you this about training, because I find that's a very sort of interesting question for me, because I begin to wonder if, just like you're trained in your police academy training and then I guess continued maintenance training or whatever, to react. You recognize somebody's pulling a gun. You're going through those exercises. Somebody's pulling a gun, you pull your gun. Just as the reaction is trained in pulling the gun, and that is a trained thing, the reaction in speaking at the same time can be trained as well. And I think we need another better level of trained cops to be trained to do that at the same time.
Can I challenge you?
Please.
Absolutely.
In my younger years as a police officer, we had something that I ran called Community Police Academy. And basically, we had individuals that were supportive of law enforcement, along with individuals that were not supportive of law enforcement, go through a 3-month mock police academy. And part of that Community Police Academy training, we had what we call the FAT simulator, which is a firearms training simulator, which basically you're put in a very large controlled room. You have a computer program gun, a computer program that runs the screen, and you're put in different scenarios in which you have to utilize department policy to whether to draw and exhibit your weapon, or whether to fire your weapon. Yeah. And it gives a whole new perspective and understanding of the question of, well, I think that this can be done, and I think that that can be done.
Well, I think it's really interesting that a police officer would feel like that their training, and hear me with this. I'm not trying to hurt anybody's feelings here. But
don't worry, you can't hurt my feelings, and if you do, I already deployed a drone. It's right outside your backyard window there. So.
That's what that noise is up there. I was wondering. I couldn't figure that out.
You have had the floor. I want to jump in here.
Okay.
I know, but I'm about to leave in 1 minute. So,
that's why, because I trust you. Go on.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Because this is really fascinating. I do want to continue the conversation, but what you're saying is the training, another level, another standard of training can't be brought up. A higher level of expectation can't be reached. And Erin and I were talking about this just the other day, that there are very few occupations, and we were talking about this in the context of qualified immunity. There are very few occupations that the standards and expectations don't change. And if you are going to stay in that occupation, you have to adapt or die. You have to meet that level of standard. And so I think, as I leave here, what I want to ask you, and maybe you can answer this to Erin, is, do you think, to what degree, and again, I know you like to talk about your perspective. I'm asking you to look at policing writ large. And to what degree do you think these notions of 8 can't wait can affect and help dismantle systemic racism within law enforcement?
Okay, well, the 8 can't wait is not going to dismantle systemic racism in law enforcement.